Hey guys, DG Thunderer here. I recently had the honor and pleasure of being able to lead a workshop for Lodge of Sorceresses. If you're not familiar with Lodge of Sorceresses, there will be a link with more information down below. But yeah, here's the value workshop. It is primarily audio. I do have my face recorded, but it's not always that interesting. Please listen, enjoy, and I hope you learned something new. All right. Thank you. Um, so first things first, sometimes my internet bugs out for like a couple minutes. If that happens, I'll be back on in a bit. Um, but yeah, not to worry. And hopefully that won't happen at all. So, this is a workshop about figuring out exactly how to calculate how much value you're getting. So to start off, I have a little questionnaire. You don't need to answer this. This is more just like concepts to think about, um, as we'll touch on them later in the course. So, some true false questions, um, general stuff. Hello, Kalanetta. Welcome. So using the chat room chat companion. I just posted a questionnaire. You don't need to answer the questions. It's more just like to keep it in mind. Um, so yeah, this is the value workshop. Um, so I'll give you both a minute to look over that. Um, Gulax, Yostein, welcome. We're also in the chat companion chat room, so please head on over there. I posted a questionnaire. You don't need to like answer the questions. It's more just like ideas that we'll be touching on throughout this workshop. Also, please keep in mind this is being recorded. It will be posted on the Lodge of Sorcerers' YouTube and on my YouTube as well. Yeah, I was gonna post the image of the questions on the video, but I can also read them out loud. So, like question one, true or false? The value of a play is not always the same as the tempo of the play. Question two, true or false? I opened round one with Milva for 3 and Roach for another 3, making the tempo of that play 6 points. Question 3, opponent passed round 1 up by 5 points. I played Yurden and reset 20 points from his board. How much was Yurden worth? True or false? I used Cyclops on a Harpy egg, pulling out a Harpy, so I got 8 points from the egg and 10 points from the Cyclops. Oh yeah, I'll be reading questions here in chat out loud too. True or false? Opponent played a 7 provision Lady of the Lake, and I completely countered her with my 5 provision Moon Dust. So my Moon Dust traded up on the Lady of the Lake. Number 6, I used Cyclops on a Foglet, pulling out another Foglet and dealing 3 damage. How much value was the play? Number 7, true or false? When evaluating a card to include in your deck, you simply take the average between its best and worst outcome to find its average value. And true or false? Witchers are 24 provisions and Portal is 13, making Witchers have almost double the impact on your provisions. So those are some things that we'll touch on. But yeah, let's get started. So I wanted to start off talking about the difference between tempo and value. Both are very important, and there are different types of decks that exist that value tempo and value, value, differently. Um, so the question to worksheet 1, it is indeed true. The value of a play is not always the same as the tempo of a play. Tempo is the amount the score difference changed as a result of a turn or group of turns, depending on the context in which you're referring to the tempo. So, um, worksheet question number 2. I opened round 1 with Milva for 3 and Roach for another 3, making the tempo of that play 6 points. That is true. Milva's probably going to get more value over time, but that is value, that is not tempo. Value is the amount that a single card contributed to the score difference, including potential points. So Milva is 3 guaranteed points, but then say you have 9 more Scoia'tael cards in hand, it's another 9 potential points as well, making it a potential 12-point play. And different decks need more value or more tempo. So like engine decks tend to be very high value and very low tempo decks. Hey, thanks for the good luck, Ellie. Then you have control decks, which tend to be pretty evenly split because when you use control to remove an engine, that control is actually removing a lot of potential points as well. So when you're against engine decks as control, you tend to play relatively low, like higher tempo than the engine deck, but still somewhat low tempo because you're removing lower value engines, but you're getting a lot of value by removing a lot of potential points. And then there's also mid-range decks, which tend to be very low value but high tempo. Every play has a big immediate impact, but there's not a ton of long-term value over time. All decks need some value and some tempo. It's just different decks work differently in terms of what they prioritize. There's a lot of different types of value. So tempo is value in and of itself. It's the immediate impact. And there are a number of... Excuse me, while I check my notes real quick. There's a number of different common pitfalls that we can fall into when calculating value or tempo. So for instance, overkill winning the round. This is especially true on blue coin when you have to... so on blue coin, because you're making the plays before your opponent, oftentimes if you want to win the first round, what you end up feeling like you have to do is committing a whole lot of resources to the round. Question about different decks. Go ahead, Aisha. Ooh, that's a good question. So Aisha asked about no unit decks. It's literally no tempo nor value. Yeah, so no unit decks, like there is some tempo and there is some value to what they do. But the tempo and value to what they do is completely dependent on what their opponent is doing, right? So if I play a 3-strength engine that has the potential to get another, say, 8 points over the course of the round, and you remove it with a shackles, then you have 3 tempo, but also an extra 8 potential points. So that shackle was worth a potential 11 points. And then there's also some extra like hidden value to be gathered from playing no unit decks, which is the hidden value of like you don't know exactly how much their cards need to interact with your cards. So if you're playing a no unit deck and they end up losing, say, 15 points of damage by playing cards that want to damage your units, but you have no units to damage, then that hidden value is realized as 15 points over the course of the round. But like hidden value is really hard to calculate, especially preemptively calculate. It does somewhat defy the concept with that exotic game plan, though. Yeah, a little bit. The concept of both decks needing both tempo and value, but not exclusively, because no unit decks always finish with a high tempo unit finisher, right? So whether you're playing like Aglaeus or I don't know what else there is, even something like a Siri Nova, scorch everything and Nova comes back. It's still like a high tempo, like big finisher kind of thing. Um, so they need their value plays in order. Is it really a no unit deck? Um, yeah, I mean no unit is an exaggeration. We sort of recognize that like it needs to have a unit to win a round. Best it can do otherwise is tie the game. So yeah, no unit is an exaggeration, but it's pretty close to true. Um, yeah, no unit decks are a bit weird in terms of this, but I think it still can be broken down into like they have their tempo and they have their value. It's a lot more dependent on what their opponent does because they're like super heavy control usually. But they still have tempo and they still have value. Um, so we were talking about pitfalls that you can often run into, and I was talking about overkill. This is especially true on Blue Coin because you have to make the first play. Oftentimes, it feels like if you don't, if you play a small play, your opponent can just pass you with a big play, or at least keep up so that they can always win the round. And if you really want to win the round, oftentimes it feels like you need to really overcommit. Um, and if you end up playing like a really big play and it causes them to pass and you win the round, you have to really question how much value you're getting from that big play because maybe not all the points from that big play were necessary. Um, a more easy to recognize scenario is from question three, where we said the opponent passed round one up by 5 points. I played Yurden and reset 20 points from his board. How much was Yurden worth? Well, Yurden's 2 points. He reset 20 points, so it's theoretically 22 points. But because you only needed 6 points to win the round, really that Yurden was only worth 6 points. It might still be the right play if you don't think that you're going to get a good Yurden in the next round. But like overkilling the round doesn't actually matter. You only need one extra point to win. And so don't calculate the value you get off of your cards based on the total swing if all that was needed was less. Another common pitfall that we run into is double counting points. So worksheet number 4, I used Cyclops on Harpy Egg, pulling out a Harpy. So I got 8 points from the egg and 10 points from the Cyclops. That is false because you could either get 8 points from the egg, 3 points from the egg plus the 5 from the Harpy, or 10 points from the Cyclops, 5 from the Cyclops, 5 from the Harpy. But you can't count the 5 points from the Harpy to both the egg and the Cyclops. You have to choose one or the other, or split it 50-50. So you could say the egg was worth 5.5 points and the Cyclops was worth 7.5 because you need both to make the combo work. So it's really important that when there's cards that specifically synergize with each other, it's easy to give the extra synergy points, in this case the Harpy, to both of the cards, but you need to make sure that you don't double count those synergy points. Um, Another pitfall is the idea of trading up. Honestly, when it comes to playing the game, provisions are not really important. Sometimes there are certain cards that interact with provisions. So we have like a Horrocrux and we have the new Nilfgaard card, Vivian. And they do interact with provisions. But in terms of question number 5 in the worksheet, my opponent played the 7 provision Lady of the Lake, and I completely countered her with my 5 provision Moondust. So my Moondust traded up on their Lady of the Lake. That's actually not true. Your Moondust traded even with their Lady of the Lake. The fact that the provisions were different doesn't really matter because during the course of a game of Gwent, first of all, you have leaders with different provision caps, and you also have different people making different draws. It's possible that you might have a high value card left in your deck and your opponent doesn't have any. And that can really just throw off the calculations in the terms of like trading up with provisions. Like, yes, there is something to be said fighting for a round when they make big plays and you don't, but it's not really something that you can like calculate towards like trading up on your opponent. Um, Instead, I prefer to think of it in terms of like win conditions. So, say for instance, your opponent uses, trying to think of a big win condition, Tibor or something, um, and you're able to fight in the round that they play Tibor, or fight in the round that they play, what's his name, Codwell, um, and you're able to do that without making a big commitment. That is that is good, but it's not good in the sense of like you traded up. So does that work with trading a gold for a bronze? Does it really count as trading up, or is it just something we have in our head? So really, there is no difference between golds and bronzes from a playing perspective. Um, there's a difference in terms of deck building. You can only have one gold. You can have two bronzes. But in terms of like a value worth, there's really no difference in when you're in the middle of a game. So yeah, I would say it also applies to gold and bronzes. Like, you counted their gold with a bronze, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is the net tempo between those two turns, and also like the number of win conditions spent. Because sometimes you do see someone commit like 2 win conditions to round 1, and their opponent just backs out of the round, and then come round 3, the opponent has multiple win conditions left, while that person has like a weak win condition left or something like that, and the opponent easily takes round 3. And so there is a sense of like trading up on points, like getting more resources, more value out of your opponent in one round, but it's not really dependent on provisions nor the color or rarity of the cards used. It's really just dependent in terms of like the win conditions that the deck is built around. And naturally that does like relate a little bit to the provisions, but it's not a direct one-to-one relationship. Okay, other types of value. We have potential points. So potential points are points that might manifest later. So this is most typically like future value from engines, something like resilience, or hand buffing. And I think that's all pretty straightforward. Like hand buff, like it may not actually happen. They might play Shylard and destroy your hand buff potential points, or maybe you know, play the Hawker Smuggler and it buffs a card that you want to mulligan later and you don't end up playing it. So it's not points that you can like inherently count as like being realized, but they're almost there. Resilience is potential points because maybe you play Resilient Unit in round 2 and there is no round 3, or maybe it just gets removed before the next round. The same with engines, maybe they get removed and you don't actually get to use their abilities. And then the last type of value is intangible points, points that cannot be properly valued. So a good example is thinning. It's really not clear how many points thinning gets you. If thinning is the difference between drawing a 5.4 provision card and drawing your, 12 provision win condition, then a single thinning could potentially be worth, 15 points. But other times, it'll just be the difference between drawing a 5.4 provision card and a 7.5 or 6 provision card, in which case it's just worth a couple points. Sometimes it doesn't even make a difference on what you draw. Sometimes you get the right draws anyways. So it's really intangible. It's hard to calculate exactly how many points thinning is worth. But it is important to note. So for, let's see, this is question 6 we're on now. I use Cyclops on a Foglet, pulling out my other Foglet and dealing 3 damage. How much value was that play? I would like to classify that as 5 points, because you lost a Foglet, gained a Foglet, that's a net 0. And you played the Cyclops for 5 points. Oh, sorry, 8 points, because you also dealt 3 damage. Um, so it's 8 points plus 1 thinning. You can't really qualify that to any number of points, but it is important to know that it's there. It's also important to note that different decks value thinning differently. For instance, a very mid-range deck that has a bunch of pretty good high-tempo plays, but not a ton of like big game winners, they're going to value thinning less than a deck that is extremely synergistic and relies on like a single big win condition. Welcome, Ronstar. We are in the chat companion chat room. You can post questions there. If you scroll up a little bit, I have a worksheet with some questions to think about. Another type of intangible points is sort of the opposite of deck thinning, and that would be deck disruption. So that's pretty much exclusive to Nilfgaard right now, but you've got Infiltrator, you've got Cantarella, and you've got what's the guy with the really hard name to pronounce? Fragef, I think it is. So these are cards that can disrupt what your opponent has in plan. Maybe it, effectively unthins their deck by 1 with an Infiltrator, or maybe it steals like an important card from them. And this is to be distinguished as different from something like using Ardol to steal a unit, or a Muzzle. Because even though using Vragef to get rid of a card from their deck kind of feels like Ardol, the difference is that Ardol realizes the points right away, whereas removing a unit from their deck, maybe instead they actually draw a better unit. Like, you don't really know what they're going to have instead of that unit. So it's intangible. You can't really classify how many points it is, but it is worth something. Trehern I'm not going to try to pronounce that last name. But yeah, any questions up to this point? Anyone who joined in a bit late have any questions? It is a really ridiculous name. Rodstar, I'm not really talking about the current meta in this workshop. Honestly, have not been playing a ton of Gwent recently. I'm not very familiar with the current meta, so I don't feel equipped to answer that question. I feel like I have been playing so much Gwent recently that I kind of like got burned out from it, so I've taken a break. Like, I still love the game, and a lot of the concepts. That's why I'm doing this value workshop right now. Like, I love the concepts of like getting the most value out of it, but I've not been enjoying playing it just right now. I don't know how to say your Discord name, but I know you're Weevil. um, Relationship between value and the mentality behind passing. That's a good question. There's sort of 2 approaches to passing, I feel like. There's a value-based reason to pass. Well, okay, there's 3. There's one reason to pass, which is just it's how your deck works. I got the important cards out so that they're in the graveyard so I can use them later, or I got hand buff on Sheldon Skaggs, something along those lines. That's one reason. Another reason is tempo. Like, they've just played way too much tempo. I can't catch up with them. I'm going to lose a card if I keep playing, and I need to pass. And then another reason is value. So a classic example of passing because of value is if you're playing against a deck with a ton of engines, and you want to try to like split up their engines. So like maybe you play 7 cards down to like 3 left or 2 left in round one. They've probably gotten a lot of value off of their engines, but when they draw back up, it's going to be a 8 or so card round in round three. And like maybe if you save some of your good cards or you have your big combo or something, maybe you can actually deal with that in round three. Um, or you can maybe hope to pass a bit earlier in round one, hoping that you have enough of a tempo lead over their engines that they actually pass as well, and then maybe you can push them in round two to try to keep draining their engines and taxing their overall value. Because when you have a lot of potential points, you're not going to realize those potential points until unless the round goes on for a time. Does that answer your question, Weevil? Or are you looking for something a little more specific? Thank you, Calinetta. The whole playing for value thing is also playing chicken with your opponent to pass first. Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that. Um, it kind of works both ways, right? Like if I'm playing value and low tempo and you're playing high tempo low value, you could potentially like pass and say, okay, I dare you to take the round now and deal with my tempo. But at the same time, I could say, I dare you to pass. I'll just spend, down to 4 cards to take this round, however many extra that is. And um, I'll dry pass round two, be drawn up to 10 cards in round three, and you won't be able to deal with my value in round three. So yeah, there's a lot of baiting, trying to read into your opponent's game plan and stuff when it comes to that. Yes, just a reiteration for those who are coming in late. This is the audio is being recorded. I'm going to post it to my YouTube channel, and it'll also be up on the Lodge of Sorceresses YouTube channel. And it's okay to ask questions by voice. The problem is if we have a lot of people like overlapping. So in some senses, asking it by text is easier. I see one more person typing in chat. If that's the last question, feel free to ask it. I do have another section to talk about after that, though. So, Rodstar, what's the best neutral Punisher card in your opinion? Punisher cards are typically very meta-specific. Um, so while I could point to cards that have a lot of, good potential, um, to use the term Punisher, that is implies that you're countering a specific deck, and that's outside of the scope of this conversation. Ah, removal. There's a lot of good neutral removal, like a lot. Um, the removal in general, and as well as like all of control, the archetype of control, is a little bit meta specific. For instance, you might be in a meta where you have Nilfgaard and Northern Realms and Scoia'tael playing like a million 3-point engines, and you just need as much removal that can do 3 damage as possible. So maybe you're like uh, maybe you even play Shackles just to remove some of those 3-point engines. But then there's other metas where you don't have 3-point engines. There's metas where you have like 5 strength Pavko Gale, 5 strength Treant Boar, um, other things like that. Or maybe in a Meve meta, you have to be worry about these 3-point engines boosted up by 1 point. And so then what you look for is you look for removal that can deal with these 5-point engines, or maybe like single pings to add into a 4-point damage like Regis. So you ping it for 1 and then you play Regis to kill it. Um, so the best type of removal is also meta specific. Um, and it also like depends like if the meta um, is very control focused, then sometimes the best removal is like small removal cards that can help you against engine decks, but don't sacrifice too much tempo so that you hopefully have more tempo than other control decks. But the reason, the fact that control is meta specific is why you'll usually see at the beginning of a new patch, engine decks are really strong. And then once the meta sort of starts to settle and people know what engine decks are strong, then people can create the control decks that counter those engine decks, and then control becomes really strong. Calinetta asks, what are the most punishing mess ups in terms of how people think of tempo and value, and how they can mess up your game plan? That's a good question. Um, I feel like the most um, the most punishing mistake that I've seen is overcommitment to round one, particularly on blue coin. Because on red coin, you know how much you have to commit to take round one, so you never really have to worry about it on red coin. But on blue coin, you don't know how much it's going to take to push your opponent out of the round to get them to pass. And um, if your game plan is to win the first round, but the cost of winning the first round is that you use like 2 win conditions, then maybe you don't have enough juice left for round three. Um, Trying to think if there's any other big ones. Um, Playing a ton of value, so like engine cards with lots of potential value, without supplementing it with any tempo. This is a little bit more of a deck building or perhaps a mulligan choice problem. Um, but if you go like all engines and you run smack into either control, like lots of control that's removing every or almost every one of your engines, or you run into just like really high tempo that drops like 5 really strong cards and passes, you can be in really big trouble, um, and it can put you in a situation where you're down a card in round three. I'm sure there's others, but those are the two that come to the top of my head. Okay. Yeah, I would classify Lyrian Arbalist as a engine card, Asia. It's got potential value. Its potential value is 1 plus however many order units you have in your hand that round, or can manage to play if you have something like a Dandelion Poet or uh, Vernon Roach. Yostin asks, is there generally more value in removing cards on your opponent's side versus putting points on your side? So that entirely depends. So if you're playing control, you have lots of removal, and you go against a mid-range deck who's dropping things that are just a bunch of solid good points. Not a ton of synergies, not a ton of potential points. They're just making good play after good play after good play. Think your pretty typical Nilfgaard with their 3 Viper Witchers, etc. Well, removing Ox doesn't really get you anything, because it doesn't matter if Ox is on board, it matters if Ox is in hand when you go to play Sarret. So, like, doing damage to those units, it's only worth as many points as the damage is. So, in the case of Regis, you play a 9 provision card for 8 points. And that's not terrible, but it's also not great. But then against engines, say they play Pavko Gale, which is it's either 8 or 9 provisions. You drop Regis and ping with Croc, and Pavko Gale's gone, and you have an extra 4 points. You traded up a ton on their engine, and you also countered all the potential points that their engine would have gotten. So, if you're playing against engines, then yes. If you're playing against tempo, then no. If you're playing against tempo, it doesn't really matter if you're putting points on your side of the board or removing points from their side of the board. But on average, yes, a little bit. It depends on the meta, how much engine there is, and how much tempo there is, and how much control there is. Yeah, yeah. Roach is a bit of an exception because of Vivian and Asire. Um, that is true. Like, yeah, there are synergies you should be aware of, and sometimes like killing Roach with Regis is good because it removes the Asire play. Vivian will probably find value elsewhere, but yeah, it is usually better to remove points from your opponent's side of the board. But so if you're deciding whether to put either Unicorn or Chironex in your deck, but for some reason not both, don't ask me why. Chironex is the better option because it's the same provision point for the same number of points, but Chironex has the potential to add some extra utility by removing their stuff. Unless you're playing like a ton of engines yourself and you want to keep one of your engines safe with Unicorn. There's some value to that, but usually removal is stronger. All right, let's move on to the deck building section. So the worth of a card. I've talked about ways to value how much your plays are, but now let's think as a deck builder how much a card is worth. So say that we know the best case scenario for a card and the worst case scenario for a card. So example, Vivian. Sometimes you play Vivian on what's a good target? No one really plays Igni. Let's say Yurden. And I think you get like 13 points from that. And that's a really good case scenario. Worst case scenario, you're getting like 5 or 6, and that's pretty bad. But then what we need to know other scenarios too. So like Vivian on Roach is a 10-point scenario. So we have a bunch of different scenarios that could happen. We then need to sort of roughly calculate, and this is all estimates, mind you. Like, we can't calculate this exactly, but we estimate, like, how often am I going to get a Vivian on my Geralt Yurden? How often am I going to get a Vivian on Roach? And how often is my Vivian going to fall flat and give me like 5 or 6 points? And then we need to do a weighted average of all of these things. It's impossible to calculate exactly, but say that in like maybe 10% of games you can get Vivian on Yurden, and maybe like 5% of games she's only worth like 5 or 6 points, and the rest of the games you're getting 10 points on Roach. Well, then Vivian on average is worth about like nine, like just under 10 points if you sort of weight all of those. Um, so it's a matter of like taking all the different things and doing a weighted average. Like it's really likely that the 10 points will happen, so she's pretty darn close to 10 points. Small chance of being a little bit more, small chance of being a lot less. Averages out to just about 10 points. People in chat are talking about Gimpy. Gimpy's really hard to calculate because he's like so draw dependent, right? If you get Gimpy at the right time and you put all the best cards back in your deck, then yeah, Gimpy can be like absurd amounts of points. But other times, Gimpy's a 2 point card in round three. Other times, you have a crap draw in round one and you don't even want to play Gimpy because you don't want to put all that crap back in your deck. Gimpy is really hard to calculate. I chose Vivian because that's a little bit more straightforward. Um, so yeah, keeping in mind of like all the ways that we talked about the common pitfalls of like calculating, say, Harpy Egg twice. Um, Harpy Egg is another good example. Like if we're running a good bit of consume or Cyclops type effects, then maybe Harpy Egg is pretty much giving us that Harpy every single game. So we could value the Harpy Egg at like a total of 5 point, maybe 4 points, because very occasionally we don't get the trigger from it. This is a, but then maybe you're playing Unseen Elder, and maybe you're also playing the Shadow thing. I forget what exactly it's called, but the thing that triggers a bronze unit's Death Wish. Um, Maelorn. Um, and maybe you're getting, you know, 5 points from the Harpy Egg every game, or one Harpy out every game from your Harpy Egg, but then every third game you're getting two, or maybe even every other game you're getting two. And then maybe you actually value the Harpy Egg at 8 points, which is really good. And then Cyclops, similarly, like if you're getting an extra like 5 points from the Cyclops, again, keeping in mind you have to split um, the extra points between the Cyclops and the Harpy Egg, but you're also getting some removal. So maybe those 3 points from the Harpy Egg that you do damage removes an engine. In that scenario, the Cyclops is not only the 7.5 points from half of the Harpy and the Cyclops body, but it's also removing all of these potential points on this engine. So maybe it's actually up to like, you know, 14 some games. So these are just like things to keep in mind. You sort of like add all these scenarios in, weight the average, and you can start to calculate how good individual cards are. And then, of course, there's synergies that make it really complicated. Like Cyclops is great, but if I take Harpy Egg out, well, now how good is it? Is it still worth playing? Things like that. It's not easy, is kind of what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of calculations, a lot of trial and error, a lot of meta assessment. Because if you're playing against engine decks all the time, well, then yeah, Cyclops is great. But if you're not, well, maybe if you're not running Harpy Egg, Cyclops isn't worth it. So, worksheet number 7, when evaluating a true or false, when evaluating a card to include in your deck, you simply take the average between its best and worst outcome to find its average value. That's not quite true. That's almost true. But you need to calculate the middling outcomes as well. And you also need to do a weighted average based on the percentage of likelihood that you get those outcomes. Another thing that affects the worth of a card is how useful is this card against matchups that are good matchups or against matchups that are bad matchups. For instance, a lot of points in an easy matchup, well, it's already an easy matchup. Maybe those tons of points aren't what you want to be including in your deck. Because yes, it's nice to make an easy matchup even better. Don't get me wrong, you always want that. But maybe what you need to be focusing on are the harder matchups. So maybe you include some cards that are more points in the matchups that you find harder. So you're playing like a Woodland Monsters, you have tons of tempo. Maybe you're really good against control decks and against tempo decks. But and normally you would think, well, I'm playing high tempo. I don't really have many synergies in my deck, so I don't run Cyclops. But maybe Cyclops is the tool that actually helps you contend against engine decks. So maybe you still do run Cyclops just for that reason, because he can help you in this otherwise harder matchup. Lastly, let's talk about provision opportunity cost. So obviously there's the provision cost on a card. We've got Portal, 13 provisions, done. But I like to look at things a little bit differently. The way I see it, 4 provisions is the minimum cost on any card. So the way you can kind of see it is your 25 card deck is automatically costing 100 provisions. Because at minimum, you're playing 25 cards at 4 provisions. That's 100 provisions gone right there. Then, say you're playing, your typical 16 provision point leader, you have an extra 66 provisions, and you can start bumping up your 4 provision cards. And you have 66 points to allocate to bump up cards and make them better. So the opportunity cost is the difference between playing a run-of-the-mill 4 provision card and playing the card that you are playing. So if we look at question number 6 in the worksheet, true or false, Witchers are 24 provisions and Portal is 13, making Witchers have almost double the impact on your provisions. Well, that's not actually true. Because when you look at it, Witchers are 24, but they're 4 cards. And 4 cards, an inherent cost of, I think they're all 7. So they're kind of each 3 opportunity cost. You're bumping up 3 4 provision cards to 7. That's, no, sorry. They're 8, aren't they? They got nerfed really hard. They're 8. So you're bumping 3 cards up by 4. So it's kind of like a 12 provision opportunity cost. So you're using 12 of your extra provision points to run Witchers instead of running 4 or 3 simple 4-drops. And then with Portal being 13, we can do the same sort of thing. It's 13, which is math, 9 more than the base 4-point card. So in a way to look at it is Portal is 9 opportunity, 9 of your extra provision points, and Witchers are 12. So yes, Witchers are more. You do pay more opportunity cost for your thinning, but they are not twice as much more. They're third as much, 1 1/3. So I like to think about it that way, because, like, in some sense, like, I'm glad that the provision costs are what they are, because you have this sort of general feel of, like, each card should provide points equal to its provision cost plus a little something. So in that sense, the costing, the way that they run the provision system makes a lot of sense. But because 4 is the minimum, there's sort of this idea of, like, the cost that it actually takes to put a 7 provision card into your deck is really only 3 provisions, because you have to do 4 anyways. And that could change. Maybe one day they'll introduce a 3-cost card and this theory will sort of go out of the window. But even then, you would say that the 3 provision card is like it's a +1 provision card. That's really bad, but gives you an extra provision elsewhere in your deck. Like, you can still sort of do the same idea. And the reason I like to do that is just because it helps, like, put into perspective how many points you're actually committing. So if the average cost of a 4 provision, or the average payoff of a 4 provision card is like 6 points, a little bit under 6 points, then You start calculating, okay, so if I put 3 provisions into this card, um, helps to see how bad Usurper actually is. Usurper's interesting. I'll touch on that in a second. Um, but yeah, the cost of putting a 7 cost card in your deck, if like you bump up 3 provisions, and if it takes you from a bit under 6 points for playing a 4 provision card to about 9 and a bit or so for playing a 7 provision card, or maybe not quite 9, maybe we're looking more like 8. Then we're bumping up like 2.5 points for 3 provisions. Is that worth it? Or maybe the 4 provision card that you drop is just a 4 or 5 point provision card, and then you're bumping it up more points. Sorry, 4 or 5 point 4 provision card. But yeah, in terms of Usurper, Usurper, I don't think Usurper is meant to be played just willy nilly. He's very specifically like a meta tech choice. So if you're playing against a lot of decks that rely on their leaders, say you're playing against Croc. Croc is, I believe, 16 provisions now. Um, and without Croc, they really struggle to get Bloodthirst, and a bunch of cards in their deck are a lot worse because of that. You have to calculate like how many points you get. But yeah, I think Usurper typically is pretty bad. Because even if a lot of cards in their deck aren't nearly as good, like Croc usually still has secondary ways to start triggering Bloodthirst. Usually you run like Longships. Maybe you can shut them all down. Maybe you can't. But then also, okay, so their Pirate Captains are dead. They just mulligan those away or discard them. And like honestly, they're not a great card to keep anyways. I think yeah, 6 points is decent, but it's not great compared to Burn a Brand discarding a single the 2 strength guy that comes out onto the board, and also optimizing your hand. Like that's just strictly better than a Pirate Captain, unless the Pirate Captain's removing an engine. But against Usurper, usually there's not a ton of engines like that you want to remove. So yeah, Usurper is like very specific tech. Like if there's something that like needs to happen that only the leader can do, then yes, Usurper is okay. He has a place, but that's I've not seen a meta yet where that's so prevalent that Usurper is worth playing. Um, so yeah, typically speaking, like general idea when it comes to deck building is a 4 provision card is like 5 and some points, and then each provision you add on, you want to get like 1 more point out of the card. And as you start getting towards the higher numbers, it starts to taper down. Um, because, and the reason it tapers down is because the tempo from a strong play is valuable in and of itself. So theoretically, 12-point play is twice as good as a 6-point play, but 12-point plays have the potential to get you card advantage going into the next round, because it has the potential to make such a strong play that your opponent cannot respond to it. And that potential makes it worth more than twice as much as a 6-point play. Which is why a 12-point play will usually cost like actually 12 provisions, or maybe even 13 provisions, whereas a 6-point play will cost like 4 or 5. Any questions about deck building? Yeah, that's true, Weevil. Also depends on point distribution. Barnabas is better than Old Spear Tip in theory, even though they are both worth 12. Um, the thing about Barnabas is he's not a proactive play. He's also not guaranteed to be worth 12. So, whereas Spear Tip, he's completely proactive. You don't need anything else. There's no synergies whatsoever. So there's a lot of value to Spear Tip because Spear Tip is worth 12, period. Whereas Barnabas is like taking into terms like the, weighting all the average. Spear Tip is always 12, exactly 12. Like, yes, there are cards that can change that. For instance, Shylard or Curse of Corruption burning him. But those are kind of values that go to the opponent's cards teching in for our choice of play, and we do have to consider that. Like, everything when it comes to deck building is somewhat meta dependent. Yeah, Vincent's another example. Yep. But it's possible that we will give our opponent's tech cards a lot of value by playing Spear Tip, but our Spear Tip is always going to give us 12 points. Whereas Barnabas, you could say he's better, he's cheaper, and he's not, all 12 points on a single body, but he's also boost, and maybe boost is vulnerable to Yrden or something along those lines. And he also requires synergy, where you have like a current setup, and maybe you can't guarantee that setup. Maybe you only get 10 points because you can't find a Dryad or you can't find a Dwarf. But yes, in general, spreading out your points is less punishable and safer. But like there are tech that's usually true. That is definitely true in the current meta. But in sort of like a meta neutral context, there are punishments to wide strategies. There are punishments to boost strategies. There are punishments to self-damaging strategies, and there are punishments to tall strategies. So like the meta choices and counters to all sorts of different approaches do exist. Um, and I will definitely agree with you. Like, in this meta, currently, tall units are strong, and thus tall removal is strong. Whereas the boost and the wide strategies aren't nearly as strong nor worth teching against in the current meta. So, like, having a good card like Barnabas that does play a little bit wide, but not too wide, is really nice because he's less punishable. In theory, there are also ways to punish Barnabas as well. So, I agree. I would just say, like, look at the meta, see that there is tall removal out there, and because of that, maybe consider playing something more like Barnabas. Sorry, I harped on that point a lot. All to say, a relatively simple concept. It just took me a while to get there. Any other questions? Cool, cool. I'm going to say that's no more questions then. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope this was helpful. Um, Put some good ideas, um, and will help you understand the value of your plays and the value of your cards when it comes to deck building. As sort of a parting note, like, the better we understand the value of the plays that we're making, the better we can critique our playstyle, right? So understanding, like, I managed to get a lot of value out of this card, I didn't get value out of this card, it helps you understand what choices lead to getting good value out of your cards, um, and so on. It can also help you identify a card that, like, maybe you net deck. There's no shame in net decking. I net deck if I want to actually play a good deck. When I create my own decks, they're usually not the best. um, but maybe you net deck, but you start, like, calculating how much value you're getting from your cards, and you start realizing that one card is underperforming. Maybe that's because the person that you got the deck from was playing in a meta where that card was actually pretty good. But maybe at the MMR you're at, or maybe it's a couple weeks after they posted the list, and maybe the meta's just shifted a little bit. so that that card's not as good. And identifying how much value that card is getting you regularly can help you identify that maybe it's a weak point in the deck and maybe it's worth swapping out for something better. So, yeah, I hope this helped. Thank you very much for coming out. And that is all.